not in a good way. European European Central Bank, Leisman, cutting rates.
Now we want to be like Europe. Is that what you're saying? Every day you sit here and you say how we don't want to be like Europe. Do you know what their growth rate is, Joe?
I know.
Like 4 times less than ours.
I know.
Or 2 times less than ours.
So bad that they have to cut rates.
But now we want to be like Europe.
We don't want to be
I'll take the 2-hour cappuccino coffee break.
Pick and choose. We love their rich, creamy sauces and their wines and their cheeses.
Are you doing Love and Death? Is that what you're doing? Woody Allen?
Sure, maybe. But it was as expected. And in its statement, the ECB said the outlook for growth has deteriorated owing to rising trade tensions. Earlier this morning, President Trump blasted Fed Chair Jay Powell on Truth Social, saying Powell has been too late and wrong on interest rates, and Powell's termination cannot come fast enough. Join us now, Steve Leisman, former Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester. She's now a professor at Wharton and a CNBC contributor. I guess I knew that, Loretta. Congratulations. Did you send out announcements? That must have been
highest achievement of my career.
You sound a little bit, I won't say sarcastic, but tongue-in-cheek. You think we ought to cut, Loretta? Do you think we've had a couple of money guys on that I respect their opinion. They didn't dismiss it out of hand, that maybe we are too tight. There's so much uncertainty, and maybe this time inflation really is transitory because it's just a one-time thing with tariffs.
Yeah, so I think you've pointed out sort of the tension right now in that we just don't know whether the tariffs are going to be a one-time price increase and therefore not really be inflationary for a long time. And we don't know really where things are going to land, so it's hard to evaluate what the growth implications of the tariffs are going to be. And remember, there's other policy changes coming later in the year. You know, if you think about tax cuts, they wouldn't be weighing on the economy. They could be buoying the economy. So I think it's right now to think, if you're at the Fed, what can you do with your policy tools to ensure that the increase in the tariffs don't become a more permanent or more persistent increase in inflation? And what they can do with their tools is to make sure that inflation expectations don't get out of control. And this is usually the medium and longer run, which is what the Fed's focused on. So that, I think at this point, what they're doing and what they're explaining and communicating is the right policy. Look, we're going to sort of make sure that we can keep inflation expectations anchored. That's going to help in terms of making sure that tariff increases, price increases don't become embedded in the economy and persistent inflation. And we're also going to keep in mind our other part of our mandate and be prepared if it does seem like, the employment part of the mandate is getting farther away and things are weighing on the labor market in a way that's a material, downside, then we're prepared to do what we have to do. But right now, we don't know the size of that. We don't know where the tariff policy is going to land. And so right now, what they're doing is weighing those two and trying to do what they can do with their tools to ensure that inflation remains under control. And it could be that we have a benign scenario as things play out, that it is a one-off price increase, inflation measures move up temporarily, then move back down. And perhaps the growth impact of the tariffs isn't as large as some of us fear. And then we can get back to where we were before all this uncertainty with the trade policy inflicted itself. And then we could get back to where we were, where the economy is moving back towards maximum employment and moving back towards 2% inflation and rates could come down. But there's another scenario where things are not in a good place, that the one-off increases in tariffs are not one-off. There's a series of those. There's retaliations. The uncertainty continues. It weighs on the economy. And that's a bad spot to be in. There you're going to have a lower growth, higher unemployment, and perhaps higher inflation. And so I think the Fed's trying to do is do what it can do with its tools to prevent that scenario having as high a weight as it could.
When you started and were arguing, or at least making the case about inflation and how the Fed wants to be ready, to make sure that's put to bed permanently, I was thinking all the things that you said I could have said We want to make sure that we preempt any slowdown in the economy from the uncertainty from the tariffs and from the dampening effect on consumer sentiment. But all that is assuming that the economy really is slowing. And you point out labor's still strong, and all the fears that we've seen so far could have been, looking into the abyss, you turn the lights on, and maybe we have to fear is fear itself. Maybe you're right. But I thought I could have put in a slowdown to preempt every time you talked about preempting inflation. It just depends on what you think the greater risk is at this point. And I think the case can be made.
You're right.
And that's why we could go to stagflation.
They want to balance them. But the Fed, with its policy tool, the interest rate, isn't going to be able to prevent the kinds of things in the bad scenario, right? All the Fed can do with its tool is to sort of cushion the transition of the economy from, where we are now to perhaps a slower growth. That's what they can do, right? But we have this transition going on because this policy change is significant. These are not marginal changes we're talking about. Even if you believe that the reciprocal tariff part of it is going to be negotiated away, which hopefully it will be, you have a 10% universal tariff. You have a very high tariffs on China. So those kind of big changes, and they're structural changes, the Fed isn't really, with its tool, can't really do much about that. It can help ease the transition, cushion the transition. So it really has to be focused on what is in its control. And what's in its control is to make sure that the inflation doesn't become embedded in the economy, because that would be worse for growth too, right? The best thing the Fed can do with its policy tools is to make sure that we have price stability, because that's going to help in terms of where we end up in the economy. Loretta, and eventually, you're right, we might have to, they might find themselves, right, in the benign scenario, they were reducing rates because they were trying to get to balance. In the more problematic scenario, they're going to want to cushion as much as they can. But we don't know right now how big that will be, which scenario we're going to be in. So right now, what they can do is do all they can to make sure that inflation expectations remain, stable, relatively stable.
Loretta, there's also some important differences between the ECB and the Fed, or the U.S. and Europe. I mean, they have better bread, better chocolate, better coffee. But that's just not, if you look at you agree, Joe?
Rich, creamy sauces.
The creamy sauces, all that nice stuff. We can do some of that in America, but not as uniformly great. But take a look at a chart that I put together of the difference between the U.S. and Europe. And what you find is that ECB is closer to their 2% target on inflation. They have much lower growth. Their unemployment rate is quite a bit higher. And I'm looking at the inflation outlook. I may not have updated the precise current inflation outlook, but it is closer to their 2% target than we are. The unemployment rate quite a bit higher. GDP is just awful compared to how well we did year over year in Q4.
Wow, that's a record.
So, and there's their policy rate, which is down more than ours. They had higher inflation. They came down further. So it could be, and it may well always be, that the Fed gets this wrong. Who knows? But you have to operate by your guiding light, if I'm not mistaken, and that is your inflation outlook. And
your dual mandate.
And your inflation outlook is 2.8. Your unemployment rate is at or near maximum.
You're favoring inflation. You are, and so is Loretta. You're favoring one part of the dual mandate. If you want to, that's
why am I favoring one part of the dual mandate?
Because you're saying that's their most then it should be one.
Hold on. My unemployment rate is at or near full. My GDP is above expectations. My jobless claims are 215.
Again, that's why the Fed is never ahead of the curve, because they're always looking at behind us. What about oil?
Because which gauge should it follow that has perfect sight on the future?
Oil. The expectations. Don't you think the economy's falling off? Everybody else wants to think that about it.
We're arguing, and Loretta's sitting there with all the knowledge, Joe.
Trump is killing the economy.
I just want to ask Loretta.
See, the other point is that the European economy is more exposed to trade than the U.S. economy is. So when they're forecasting out, you're right, they're starting in a very different place than we are, but they're also doing forecasts and they're more exposed to trade. So the tariffs are going to have an impact on their economy, perhaps larger than on our economy.
But we're the ones with the high tariffs. They're not going to have, in fact, they may get an influx of cheap Chinese goods. They may tariff our stuff, but they're not going to tariff other people like we are.
The tariffs are going to affect their exports, which is kind of part of the point. So,
but that's downward pressure, not upward pressure. Downward pressure on growth, not upward.
Right, exactly. So that's what I'm saying, right? So when they're thinking about the balance of where they want their economy to be, they have to have a different lens than we would, right? So they're more exposed to trade. It's it's good to depressing on their economy, and so that's part of the calculus there.
So just do one scenario for me, Loretta, here, which is, let's imagine the June employment and inflation numbers. Let's say unemployment cranks up to 4.5, up 0.3. Let's say you have a 0.5 percentage point on your core PCE. What do you do in June?
Well, right. So this is the thing, and that'll be key of looking at, okay, do we really think that the increase in the prices we're seeing are not going to get embedded in inflation? And do we think that the increase in unemployment is going to be sustained and even worse? And that's the balancing the Fed's going to do. And there's going to be different views around the table.
What do you do, Loretta?
Sure.
What's your call?
Yeah, I would probably wait a little bit and see
June.
a little bit more about what's going on with the inflation part of the mandate. Because at that point, you hold for a little longer, right? And then once you see this material change and you've really evaluated there is a material weakening in the labor force, then you're prepared to move rates down, perhaps more than you would have if you had started earlier.
Loretta, do you mind if I thank Joe?
No.
Thank you. You know what the next best, thank you, Loretta, very much. You know what the next best thing Loretta Mester is right now?
What's that?
It's Austin Goolsbee. Next Monday.
Not on Monday.
I think it's Monday, 8:30. Is that right, guys? I think it's Monday. Monday, 8:30.
There it is.
Now, I'm not saying he's better than Loretta.
No.
Right.
Just the next best thing.
Probably more dovish.
Yeah, he is. I saw him recently on Fox. He goes on Fox all the time, but he's come such a long way in the last couple of years.
How so?
He just really takes it seriously that he shouldn't be political.
I think you're...